Good morning. It's good to be here with you today. This episode is one of Abraham's encounters with God. Quite a few that he has, and this is quite a significant one. It begins, fear not, don't be afraid. It's the first time that God says this to anyone in the Bible. I think it's used over 100 times. And that makes us ask, of course, well, what's Abraham afraid of? After this, the word of the Lord came, do not be afraid. After what? Well, everything that's happened in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham's nephew Lot had been captured in a Game of Thrones style conflict. 9 kings, tribal warlords, are mentioned and they become involved in a battle, 4 against 5. Abraham had then mounted a military operation to rescue Lot, who'd been captured in that battle. And retaliation from these warlords might then be expected. And Abraham had also turned down the opportunity to form an alliance with other local chieftains. At the end of chapter 14, verse 23, I will accept nothing belonging to you, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abraham rich. And on top of that, there'd been that previous run-in that Abraham had had with the Pharaoh of Egypt. He'd taken a shine to Sarah while they'd been down there. And that means that Abraham has got possible enemies from the north, today's eastern Syria, southeastern Turkey or Syria, right down to Egypt in the south. But a greater fear, no doubt, related to God's promises to give him a son. God had said to him that I'll give you many descendants. At different times, God has said they'll be as innumerable as the sand in the desert, or as innumerable as the stars in the sky. Abraham, of course, is over 75, and Sarah is past childbearing age, and yet Pharaoh still has taken the shine to her. Even though Abraham has won this great victory in getting back his nephew, nothing really can satisfy his desire to gain a son. And perhaps Abraham's greatest fear was that God didn't seem to be in a hurry to give them a child. How much longer would God wait? Why had he delayed? Had he changed his mind and not told Abraham? Was there some problem Abraham didn't know about? Were Abraham and Sarah doing things that were displeasing to God? And if God had promised, why so long to deliver it? But God says, don't be afraid, fear not. So there now follows this extended conversation in which Abraham asks 2 questions. What can you give me? In verse 2. And in verse 8, how can I know? Basically, Abraham is saying, I haven't got enough and I haven't got a clue. The first question ends up with Abraham believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, credited to him as righteousness. And the second question results in this elaborate setting of these carcasses, followed by Abraham's deep sleep at sunset, the thick and dreadful darkness, as it will be reminiscent of Moses going up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments. And then this mobile fire that's passing between the carcass halves. Then the personal promises, verse 13 through to 17. When God says no for certain, and there's the answer to Abraham's question, how can I know? God says no for certain. And then there's the establishing of a promised land covenant with Abraham. This is a landmark passage for both Old and New Testaments. But notice, though, those 2 questions. What can you give me? and how can I know? And both of those questions are prefaced by, but Abraham said. Now there is a complaint. There is a contradiction. In conversation with God, Abraham dares to question. And all of us at some time, of course, have grumbled and complained. It starts when we're very young, of course. I don't like the vegetables. They don't taste nice. They don't look nice. And of course, there's a particular way in which children do this. Mom, Dad. And then she hit me first, and so on. And even as adults, we complain. I've been waiting for my appointment for an hour. Excuse me, this gravy's cold. Hello, Inland Revenue, how can I be owing £10,000? And then there are various ways in which we grumble. We voice complaints to the staff in the shop, or we email the company. We mutter and we mumble under our voices. We grumble, we seethe, we sigh. But is it wrong to complain to God? Isn't there a lot of warning in the Bible about not grumbling? Aren't we told in the New Testament to be content with what we have? Doesn't the Apostle Paul tell Christian believers, do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault? I think it's helpful for us to distinguish between complaining about God and complaining to God. Complaining about God, I think, is criticized, warned off, told off even. But how about complaining directly to God? Because that's common in the prophets and Psalms. We see it from time to time among Jesus' own disciples. And I ask myself, is it an aspect of our own pilgrimage and discipleship? Not a few of the Psalms have these kinds of words, as in Psalm 142. With my voice I cry out to the Lord. With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord. I pour out my complaints before him. I tell my trouble before him. Now these psalms of complaint are so honest, they almost offend our religious sensibilities. The writers, the prayers, pour out their hearts to God. And very often they're giving voice before God of their grief. These psalms express sorrow and anger and fear, longing, confusion, desolation, repentance, disappointment, and depression. And if any of you want to know those references, give me a ring or whatever later. Probably the most famous of the Psalms is Psalm 22, because Jesus quotes it when he's on the cross. He's near death, and dare I say it, he complains. He asks God, a why question. My God, why have you forsaken me? Truth be told, the Bible is full of complaining and honest speaking to God, as well as these Psalms, Nehemiah, Job, Habakkuk, they're full of it. Let's note that in both these moments in this chapter, Abraham says, Sovereign Lord. He's recognizing, can I put it like this, the very godness of God. That he is supreme and sovereign and overruling. And let's note that this God has approved Abraham who believed the Lord, and he, the Lord, credited this believing to him as righteousness. God wasn't upset. We have a God who hears his complaint, who hears our complaint. And he is our covenant-making and covenant-keeping God, as he was for Abraham. But we still have, but Abraham said. And that means that we are allowed to complain, to bring our deepest concerns, anxieties, and questions to God. I think that passage in Hebrews, which Michael read earlier, is magnificent. It speaks about approaching God's throne with confidence, with boldness. And why not? Because that passage that writer tells us that everything already is laid there before God. Everything in creation is known to him. Somebody wrote that this word, confidence or boldness, has a long documented history in classical Greek and denotes free and open speech with one another. It means bold frankness. There's no suggestion of disrespect here. We are to come to God without hesitation or tentativeness. We're not to feel our way. We're not to feel as if we're walking on eggshells before God. We ought to come boldly and with confidence. This letter to the Hebrews, of course, is a letter to Jewish people who become Christians. It was a letter to people steeped in the customs and practices of the Jewish faith, and especially with regard to the high priest and his duties. Because this was a man who only once a year, and after finely detailed procedure, could enter God's presence, the Holy of Holies, to deal with people's sins. This man, this high priest, was the holiest man on the holiest day, being in the holiest place, doing the holiest thing. Leviticus 16 gives us all the detail. And that chapter starts off with, he is not to come whenever he chooses into the most holy place. But now, through Christ, we may come whenever we choose, boldly, frankly, daringly, with confidence. We sing it, don't we? What a friend we have in Jesus. What a privilege to carry everything. And perhaps sometimes we ought to sing, to carry anything to God in prayer. And many of us will know Charles Wesley's great line, often sung with equally great energy: bold we approach the eternal throne. There is no restricted access to God. We, his people, are the authorized personnel. When we need mercy, help, comfort, guidance, pardon, power, wisdom, and understanding, when we ask how long, with Habakkuk and Jeremiah and people in Revelation, or when we ask why, countless people throughout the Bible, we have a high priest who can and who does understand and share our difficulties. God welcomes our honest emotions, our heartfelt cries, because he's that God of grace and understanding. He expects us to bring our pain and our anguish to him. And this was how it was for Abraham. He dared to ask God, why and how can I continue to trust in the promise when the evidence against the promise seems to be all around? Someone said that it's this scandal that's faced here. It's Abraham's embrace of the scandal that makes him the father of faith. But the God with whom he has to deal, who centuries later will visit our world in the person of Jesus, is a God of kindness and generosity, of support and strength. I am your shield, protection and protector, always with you, always more than enough. You need not fear these enemies. Don't fear the past. You need not worry about my promises. Don't fret over the future. And I am your very great reward. Not a wage, nor a payment, not something owed or deserved, but a gift, a special recognition given to a faithful servant who has given or performed a bold or risky service. And in Jesus, we see this very same God. This God who has made an eternal covenant with us, making us not just his people, but making us his family, making us his children. And we may call him Abba Father. If you want this sermon in a nutshell, and I call this, Can We Complain to God? But the sermon in a nutshell is this: we may complain while we trust, and we trust while we complain. And what does that? Abraham was encouraged to look forward. We are encouraged to look backwards, to remember. And of course, God takes Abraham back to those promises. If you're afraid that others will inherit what's yours, don't. Because a son is coming from your own body who will be your heir. And to your descendants I will give this land. God hears our complaints, our questions, whatever they are. We are infinitely more fortunate than Abraham was. Because as I said, God tells him to look forward. We look backwards. God will always remind us to remember what he's given and done, especially the person, life and death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. Looking back, we might see God's fingerprints all over our lives. Perhaps he protected us from making shipwreck of our lives. Perhaps he let us grow up in a godly family. Perhaps he woke us up to the ugliness of sin in our life in a very specific way. And then pointed us to Jesus in an equally specific and particular way. His fingerprints are all over our lives. Perhaps you remember how we walked away from that accident, or how we survived that intense and painful relationship breakdown, how we had support and such good friends to guide us in our faith, and how God sustained us during that loss, that bereavement. Perhaps he healed us of something. His fingerprints are all over our lives. Remember. What about that impossible prayer request that he answered? What about that forgiveness that he offered and that we offered that we thought that we never could? Remember how the gospel came alive as it never had before. Remember God. I am your shield and your reward. That you and I, who are sinners and anti-God, that we are now his beloved children, that's a miracle. Let's never allow that wonder to fade. Remember, We have a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God who hears our complaints. We may complain while we trust, but we trust while we complain. Thanks be to God.